Senator, nice to see you.
Greta, great to see you again. Glad you're here. Thank you, and welcome to my office. And thanks for visiting Alaska so much. I know you're a big fan.
I was just there last weekend. It's a spectacular state. If people who haven't seen it, they need to see it.
It is the best.
I want to talk about the legislation, Save Our Seas.
Yes.
You were the initial sponsor of it. Tell me, where does that statute or that legislation now stand?
Well, it passed the Senate. It's Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island, and we were the two main co-sponsors on it. I have a lot of other co-sponsors. Passed the Senate, and then it just recently passed the House. They added a couple other elements to it, which are fine. So it's now back here in the Senate, and we're hoping to move it soon and get it on the President's desk. Really important piece of legislation that we think is going to benefit our state and the country and, you know, in many ways the world, because it's focused on oceans and ocean pollution and the sustainability of our oceans.
Well, what's sort of interesting for our viewers are all over the world, and they watch American politics and how deeply divided it can be, is that this is bipartisan. These are Democrats and Republicans working together, right?
Absolutely. And you know, the one thing, it's a great point that you mentioned. On certain key issues, right, there's principal differences between the parties, but the one thing I mention all the time is there is a lot that goes on in this body that's very bipartisan. You know, whether it's an act like Save Our Seas, whether it's an act, I have a bill called the Power Act that just passed the Senate, passed the House, now it's back over here. It's on helping get more legal services for survivors of domestic violence. That was my bill, but it's also very bipartisan. Or a bigger bill like the National Defense Authorization Act. We're going to vote on that this week, and that came out of the Senate Armed Services Committee, on which I sit. Very, very strong bipartisan numbers. So there's a lot of bipartisanship that goes on. You don't always read about it, but it's certainly happening.
All right, Save Our Seas.
Yes.
Why was this legislation so important?
So here's what it does. We have this big problem, not only in America, but literally all around the world, and it's dealing with ocean pollution, plastics, you know, things that don't biodegrade, and how it hurts the sustainability of our oceans, of our fisheries. And what we thought we needed to do was provide significant funding to NOAA for cleanup throughout the whole country, for states to actually declare ocean debris emergencies. So for example, when you had the big crisis in Japan, the Fukushima accident there with the tsunami, a lot of what happened in terms of ocean debris washed up on Alaska's shores. Alaska, as you know, is a big state. We have more coastline than the rest of the lower 48 states combined. So a lot of the pollution that comes from Asia ends up on Alaska's shores, but it ends up everywhere. So NOAA would be fully funded to do cleanup. But very importantly, our bill also calls for an international agreement approach to get other countries, particularly in Asia, where the vast majority of the ocean debris comes from, to do more to clean up their ocean pollution that's often pushed into the ocean, comes on America's shores. I've talked to Secretary Pompeo about this. There's a big movement internationally, and America needs to be leading that. And then finally, what was really important about this bill, it wasn't just bipartisan, but as opposed to just saying, hey, we're going to get with the environmental groups to support this, we have many conservation groups that are helping. We also went to industry and said, look, this is a big problem. You guys can be part of the solution. So we have a bunch of different industry groups that are also willing to help. So it's a good start. We're hoping to get it passed here in the Senate in the next couple of weeks.
Is anybody against it so far? I mean, do you have opponents in the Senate? Is any of industry opposed to this?
No, not really. I think, and you see, look on the news, this issue is now everywhere. And I'm glad it is. We've helped in terms of pressing it, both internationally and at home. But right now, let me give you an example. The American Chemical Association. We went to them and said, look, this is actually really important. This is not meant to be aggressive towards you. Help us solve this. And oh, by the way, if a chemical company in America finds a way to fully invent a, say, plastic bottle of water that fully biodegrades, because right now plastic doesn't, fully biodegrades, think about what that would do to the health of the oceans. Think about what that might do for the company that invents that. So we want the private sector involved on helping solutions And right now we have a good bill that's got bipartisan support, industry support, the environmental community is supporting it, so we're feeling pretty strong about this.
This is to clean up. Is there anything in the bill to sort of head it off at the pass so that we aren't dumping more stuff in it? I mean, because I imagine that, you know, the industry that makes plastic, yes, they wouldn't like something like that particularly. But what are we doing to sort of head it off at the pass so that it stops being a problem?
Well, look, you're asking the exact right question. And this is a lot of this is to focus on the cleanup portion. But as I mentioned, the bill calls for, and we've been working with the Trump administration on this, for in agreement with other countries, particularly countries in Asia, China, the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia. These are countries that account for the vast majority of ocean pollution.
Has that started up the actual conversation with these other nations, since we're all guilty, we're all polluters? But has Japan, have there been conversations with...
It is starting up. So, for example, at the G7 summit that Canada just hosted, there was a part of the statement there by the leaders focused on this issue. The Japanese next year are going to be the presidents of the G20. They want to make the cleaning of the oceans, ocean pollution, plastics, a top priority for the G20. So it's definitely happening at the international level. What we're trying to do is push not only the Congress, but the administration to focus on this. And I will tell you, Greta, it's pushing on an open door. When I talked to Secretary Pompeo about this, it was something the State Department is actually very focused on. So we think there's good momentum here, but we think passing the bill, getting on the President's desk, a sign soon, we'll keep that momentum going and put America in a leadership position on this, which we should be.
You know, it's sort of interesting. If you go to a beach, if you see junk, if you go to beaches often, you want beaches cleaned up. So you don't want the oceans to be filthy. If you live the inner part of the country, you might not spend a lot of time at the beaches and see this crisis, but you might learn that there are microplastic pieces in your fish that you're eating on the table.
And that's a huge problem, and we don't even know the extent of that problem right now. But it is a fact that right now the plastics that are in the ocean, they break down but not fully. And so they don't fully biodegrade, and those microplastics get into the food chain, and we don't really even know how that's impacting us from a health perspective, but from my perspective, it can't be good.
You know, these garbage patches in the Pacific, I'm reading about them and thinking, how did we ever let this happen to ourselves?
You know, it's a great question, and I don't know in terms of the background of how it got this bad. The good news is that finally people are waking up to it, and in the Congress it's bipartisan, and internationally it's becoming a really important issue. Look, these countries, particularly in Asia, some of them need help. They're growing really fast economically, and their waste systems haven't kept up with that economic growth and population growth. You still have certain countries that don't have, you know, sites where they put their waste. They just plow it into the ocean, and that's not helpful for the environment. It's not helpful for the oceans that we all want to keep healthy.
And away it goes. It may end up in your country, whatever your country is.
And a lot of it ends up in Alaska. And you know, you've been up there a lot. We have the most sustainable fisheries on the planet. We want to keep them that way. And one way to do that is make sure we're cleaning up the oceans and getting other countries to help. But as you mentioned, you actually raise a really important point. Helping at the source, not having countries dump tons and tons and tons of pollution and plastics into the ocean. And unfortunately in Asia, that's happening a lot still, and it's washing up on America's shores.
But I think it's also happening here. I mean, I try to be a little bit aware of myself with plastics, and then I do an interview and I find out that one of the things that they've collected a lot of are toothbrushes. And it never occurred to me that my toothbrush, you know, obviously the plastic bottles are pretty obvious one, the plastic bag's pretty obvious, but there's so many things that it didn't even occur to me that I used that are plastic.
Well, you're right, and no country's perfect, that's for sure, and we can always do a better job here. But the issue of plastics, of ocean pollution, overall we do a pretty good job on that in terms of not having the pollution that's in America. It goes to landfills, not the ocean. But other countries, it doesn't even go to landfills. It goes directly to the oceans, and we got to stop that.
And the marine life. I mean, it's terrible when you read about these turtles or these fish, and you know how we're invading their home with our plastic. I mean, that's their home.
It is their home, and we want to, you know, we want to do as much as we can to make sure that that home stays clean and sustainable. And you know, we have a pretty good track record. We actually have a really good track record in Alaska on sustainable fisheries. But if you're polluting the oceans, it's not helping.
All right. You said the House still needs to do a few different things made to the bill. What's the House?
Well,
how are they tinkering with it?
The House tinkered with it and sent it back over here. There was a provision that related to kind of a small Coast Guard issue that shouldn't be controversial here. And what I'm trying to do is actually get this passed again in the Senate, now with the House revisions to it, which we don't have an objection to. Sometimes, as you know, in the Senate, people see a moving vehicle, they see a piece of legislation that's actually got a lot of popularity, and there's sometimes attempts to add even more to it. Right now, my goal is to get this passed in the Senate again with the House amendments and get it on the President's desk.
All right. So has the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell indicated when he'd likely have a vote on this?
Not yet, but we're hoping that that this is so popular that we can do this by unanimous consent.
And do it before the end of the year?
Yes.
End of September?
I would welcome end of August.
End of August, indeed you would. I know you've worked hard on it.
So we've been working hard on it, and so is Senator Whitehouse. And again, I think your original point, very, very bipartisan piece of legislation. He and I work on a lot of things together. You know, Rhode Island's the ocean state. I don't joke with him too much about the difference between the sizes of Rhode Island and Alaska.
The smallest state and the largest.
But we're working together, and it's important for both of our states, but really important for the country. And literally the oceans all over the world.
Right. Missile defense.
Yes.
We have that in Alaska, and there's news, of course, that North Korea may have some activity, some missile activity going on. What's your thought on this?
Well, look, one thing about missile defense is, and you've been to Alaska a lot, and you were just there recently.
Been to North Korea, too.
Oh, you have been to North Korea?
Been to both places.
Never been there. I've been to South Korea a lot. But, you know, Alaska is the cornerstone of America's missile defense. The systems in Alaska, the radar systems throughout Alaska, the ground-based missile interceptors, the field at Fort Greely, it protects the entire country, whether it's Alaska or New York City or Miami. If there is an intercontinental ballistic missile shot from North Korea, it's going to be tracked and shot down by the systems based in my great state.
Are they dated?
Well, here's the good news on this. And we talk about bipartisanship. Last year I had a bill called the Advancing America's Missile Defense Act of 2017. It passed the Congress, fully funded by the President and the Trump administration, and that significantly is building up our missile defense, including an entire new field at Fort Greely. We'll have over 60 ground-based missile interceptors at Fort Greely in Alaska when this bill is actually completed. And it was a bipartisan bill. I had almost 20 Republicans and 10 Democrats on that bill. It passed overwhelmingly in the Senate as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. In this year, I had another bill that dealt with missile defense that focused more on the space-based sensors that help integrate our systems in South Korea, the THAAD system, the Aegis system, which is our missile defense on Navy ships, and the system in Alaska. That has passed the Senate. We're going to vote on that as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. So the good news is we are doing a lot more on missile defense. It's bipartisan, which means it's sustainable. And, you know, Americans want to be protected from the threat of Kim Jong-un, and we're doing a lot to build it up.
All right. The good news is you're doing a lot to build it up. Are we ready right now? I mean, if there's a need to build it up, it sort of brings to mind my question is that how are we doing right at this moment?
We're ready, but my view has always been we can add more insurance to being ready. So the system we have right now, we are ready, but the threat is increasing, and we need to have a more robust system, and that's what we're doing. That's why my bills the last 2 years have been focused on that, and both of them have been last year, did pass and was signed into law, and this year will be signed into law here soon.
Is this wrapped at all into the negotiations between the United States and North Korea? Is there any way wrapped into this?
Well, I think one of the things, the president and his team deserve a lot of credit with regard to what they've done with the support of Congress on bringing Kim Jong-un to the table. I like to talk about it. There are three things. The sanctions, the very, very strong sanctions that we have led, the United States in the UN, and the sanctions Congress has passed. The military options that Secretary Mattis has been putting together, and that is a serious look at things that we might have to do militarily. The North Koreans are aware of that, and also missile defense. Kim Jong-un, I think, is recognizing that even if he shot 1, 2, or 3 missiles at the United States, we'd have the capacity to shoot it down. We're building that capacity up even more. We would massively retaliate then. So all three of those things, when he's looking around, is thinking, maybe I need to get to the table, and I think that's what's brought him to the table.
Does our missile defense protect Japan, have the capability of protecting Japan?
The Aegis system does, absolutely, and so does the THAAD system.
All right, South Korea has a number of almost 30,000 American troops, and there's a lot of discussion about whether the president will not. I guess he said he won't bring the troops home, but there's always a discussion. What are your thoughts on the number of troops in South Korea, and who pays for it?
Well, look, I think that keeping the troops in South Korea has benefited South Korea, but it's also benefited the United States. And I had an amendment in the Defense Authorization Act that said we should not be trading legally deployed American forces on the Korean Peninsula for illegally deployed nuclear weapons. And that passed in the Senate very strongly. I made sure Secretary Mattis, Secretary Pompeo, and the President was aware of that. As a matter of fact, I mentioned this can be leveraged in the negotiations. If Kim Jong-un said that they want a trade, if President Xi Jinping is coaching the North Koreans, saying, hey, maybe this is an opportunity to remove U.S. troops, we have a sense of the Senate saying that this is not a good idea that we won't support.
If Kim Jong-un got rid of his nuclear weapons, your position on the troops would be what in South Korea?
That it would need to be absolutely, completely verifiable denuclearization before we have any discussions of removing American troops.
Assume for a moment that we could verify it, that they'd gotten rid of the nuclear weapons. I don't know if we'll ever get to that point, but hypothetically, if North Korea doesn't have any nuclear weapons or capability, then your position on troops would be what in South Korea?
My position would still be that we need to keep them there, and we would, of course, want to be having significant discussions with the South Koreans and the Japanese, all of whom care about American forces on the Korean Peninsula, which, as you know, Greta, have kept the peace and security in the region for decades. Now, you mentioned the issue of costs, and I think sometimes this does get confused. Right now, in South Korea, we are redeploying our Army forces to a place called Camp Humphreys. That's a very big U.S. Army base. It's being built south of Seoul. This is where we're consolidating all the U.S. forces there. It costs almost $12 billion, $11 billion to build that new camp. The Koreans have paid for $10.3 billion of that new camp, the new U.S. Army camp on the South Korean peninsula. So they're doing a lot to cover the expenses. I know the President has raised this a lot. I think it's good to make sure they're covering a lot of the expenses because we're keeping that part of the world safe and secure. But in terms of, for example, Camp Humphreys, the South Korean government is paying almost 93% of building that very big U.S. Army military base, and I think that's something people should know.
You know, the talk is always on the nuclear weapons, which of course, we want North Korea to not pursue their program, and we also have to worry about biological and chemical weapons as well. But right on the border between North Korea and South Korea, the North Koreans have all those artillery weapons pointed right at Seoul, which sort of gets lost in the discussion, and they could do an incredible amount of damage. A lot of people could die if they use those artillery weapons. Is there ever any discussion about those?
Well, I think it's a great point because the capacity, as you mentioned, that North Korea has to literally, do enormous damage in terms of lives and property to the residents of Seoul, which include tens of thousands of American citizens, let alone millions of South Korean citizens, is a really, really important topic. To me, the most important thing, particularly when you look at the history of North Korea, where they have made provocative actions year after year with regard to their military, including the ultimate provocative action in 1950, June of 1950, when they invaded South Korea, is to make sure we have a strong military on the peninsula and in the region that makes sure there's a deterrence capability that says if you ever do something like that, your military is going to be wiped out.
All right, one quick question on NATO. There has been a lot of discussion whether the president would pull us out of NATO. It's a treaty. And in order to get out of a treaty, as far as I can, it had to be the U.S. Senate that would get us out of the treaty. So this is a lot of saber rattling. Do you agree with me that the U.S. Senate isn't going to pull us out of NATO?
No.
Okay. So
absolutely.
But you hear the saber rattling.
Well, you hear the saber rattling. You know, the one thing I've emphasized with the administration, and again, I believe everybody agrees with this, from the President, Secretary Mattis, Secretary Pompeo, is that one of the most important strategic advantages we have in the world is that we are an ally-rich nation, and our adversaries and potential adversaries, like North Korea, like Iran, like Russia, are ally-poor. And for years, decades really, they've tried to undermine our alliances, and we shouldn't allow that to happen. We should be deepening our alliances and expanding them to other countries.
But some countries might say that the U.S. is rich, and now they're trying to demand that these other countries pay more, and that is somehow poisoning some of our relationships with our allies.
Well, look, the president's been raising this issue in NATO of contributing at a minimum 2% GDP, 2% of their GDP to their national defense. This is an issue that every president has raised literally since almost President Reagan. And what President Trump has done is he said, I'm going to raise it, and I'm going to raise it again, and I'm going to raise it again. This last NATO summit, you know, there was some drama in the run-up to it, but overall, what's happening is you're seeing with regard to our NATO allies is, as opposed to a couple of years ago where almost everybody was decreasing their defense budgets. By the way, we were decreasing our defense budgets as well. We're all starting to move our defense budgets in a positive, increased manner, and I think the president and his team deserve a lot of credit for that. We should continue to push on it, but this is a really important point. A NATO alliance is not just about money. I think what the president did in this last summit was good to get people there, but it's more than just about the checkbook. Let me give you an example. After 9/11, for the first time ever in the history of that alliance, our allies invoked Article 5 to protect us, and they sent tens of thousands of troops to Afghanistan to help us hunt down the terrorists who killed our citizens, and over 1,000 non-U.S. NATO soldiers have been killed in Afghanistan, and thousands more have been wounded. You can't put a price tag on that, and we need to remember that as Americans.
One of our NATO allies is Turkey, and the president is going back and forth with Erdogan about the American pastor. Is that going to somehow poison our relationship to some degree with our ally Turkey?
Well, look, Turkey's a really important ally, but Turkey has been doing things of late that are cause for a lot of concern. And you mentioned the pastor. We've had a number of senators, myself included, who have written the Turkish government saying this is not a way we treat each other's citizens. Right now he's essentially being held, he was held in jail. He was recently released, I think just last week, to house arrest. But this is not how long-standing allies, and Turkey has been a long-standing ally of ours. They fought in the Korean War with us. They fought in Vietnam with us. But you know, some of the things that President Erdogan has been doing are cause for concern. My view is that we need to double down with regard to working with Turkey on a whole host of issues, whether it's NATO, whether it's what's going on in Syria, in Iraq. They're a critical ally, but Erdogan needs to hear directly from the leadership of the Senate and the executive branch on areas where, you know, we're not pleased with his actions and activities.
Senator, thank you. We'll be watching your
Greta,
bill, Save Our
always a
Seas.
pleasure.
We're looking forward to see what happens with that. Thank you, sir.
Great to see you again. Thank you.